Well, good evening, everyone. There's a nice long line for refreshments, so keep in that line. We're going to make it casual tonight. But before we get going, I just want to welcome everyone to Mohi on this beautiful night. And let's give a big round of applause to the Jalaya Band, who did an amazing job. And the Jalaya Band is part of the Adafuya Cultural Education Workshop, which has been bringing African art and culture to Seattle for over 40 years. They've been around for a long time, and they've done amazing stuff. So thank you, Jalaya Band. Well, good evening. My name is Leonard Garfield, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special evening as we reflect and remember a historic moment 25 years ago when Nelson Mandela came to Seattle. Our event tonight is in concert with Mandela, the official exhibition, which is presented at Mohi all summer. It goes through Labor Day weekend. It was developed in coordination with the Mandela family, with additional curation by Mohi, and it's actually the largest exhibit ever presented here at the museum, and a special opportunity to share the life and legacy of one of history's great heroes, a singular champion of democracy, justice, and human rights. Shining a spotlight on Nelson Mandela is an extraordinary opportunity for us at Mohi and also for Seattle. It is a story that is both timeless and timely. Timeless because Mandela's legacy of justice, resistance, and reconciliation are the very foundation of democracy. But timely as well because those foundations are under attack across the globe. And we can look to and learn from the life of Nelson Mandela to remind us of democratic movements at their most courageous and of democratic values at their most compassionate. I hope if you haven't seen the exhibit yet, you will enjoy the show, that you'll share it with others, and that you'll join us in celebrating a hero for our times and all times. And as we reflect on the intersection of justice and history, I'm reminded that Nelson Mandela, who fought and triumphed over a colonial power, was a member of the Abu Thembu royal family, which long predated colonial powers in his native land. And that this evening we are on the lands and waters of Coast Salish people, whose endurance in this place from time immemorial we acknowledge today. Where were you 25 years ago? Many of you in this room, I know, were working hard to make one of the most historic events in Seattle history come to life. Others of you were preparing to listen to and learn from a great hero. Nearly everyone involved in that unforgettable event still recalls those days as once-in-a-lifetime moments. And all of us in Seattle, then and now, can learn from and still learn from that visit and see in it lessons for how we can move forward with humility, with courage, and grounded in justice. Tonight's program will actually be recorded and become a part of that history that was first made a quarter century ago. So many people have made tonight possible, and I want to start by saluting two individuals that you'll hear from later, so I won't introduce them, but I'm deeply indebted to them for inspiring this gathering, Paul Suzman and Bob Ratliff. So thank you, Paul and Bob. I also want to thank our institutional partners at the Black Heritage Society of Washington State, whose president, Stephanie Johnson-Tolliver, is with us tonight. Stephanie and BHS make everything we do at Mohi immeasurably better, so thank you, Stephanie. And I also want to thank our sponsors for the whole Mandela Initiative, both the exhibit and tonight's programs and other programs this summer, the Gates Foundation, the Boeing Company, the Mohi Exhibits Fund, the Hugh and Jane Ferguson Foundation, John and Bobby Bridge, and Madeline and Richard DeSam Lazaro. And to our media sponsors at the Seattle Times, Cascade PBS, Converge Media, and KEXP. And I want to thank our special partner this evening, Village Reach, who celebrates 25 years this year working hand in hand with governments, with the private sector, and with communities to improve how medicines and medical services are delivered to the hardest to reach people. And it's no coincidence that Village Reach is celebrating 25 years, because it all started a quarter century ago when Graca Machel and Nelson Mandela boarded a plane for Seattle, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's start this evening. It's my pleasure to welcome my MOHI colleague, co-curator of the Mandela exhibit at MOHI, and a historian, Anthony Long.
Thank you, Leonard, for your warm introduction. I would also like to thank everyone in the audience for joining us on this special evening to reflect on a significant event in Seattle's history when our city stood in the international spotlight. Revolutionary, prisoner, president, peacemaker, humanitarian, Nelson Mandela is a global icon for resistance and reconciliation. He was born Kolila Mandela on July 18, 1918, in Mvezo, South Africa, to a royal family of the Xhosa-speaking Tembu people. Mandela became involved in the African National Congress in 1944, actively participating in the fight against apartheid, where he quickly became a key figure in the ANC's campaign of peaceful nonviolent resistance against the South African government. He later helped organize an armed wing of the ANC when peaceful resistance proved ineffective. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment for sabotage and other charges related to his anti-apartheid activities. He spent 27 years in prison, becoming a symbol of the anti-apartheid movement. Mandela's imprisonment drew international attention and condemnation of apartheid, sparking a global movement to end the system of racial segregation and discrimination. He was released from prison in 1990, marking a turning point in South Africa's history. After his release, he played a crucial role in negotiating the end of apartheid and transitioning to a democratic, multiracial government. Mandela shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993, jointly with former President F.W. de Klerk, for their efforts in bringing an end to the unjust system. In April 1994, he was elected to South Africa's first Black president. Mandela's presidency focused on reconciliation, nation building, and addressing the legacy of apartheid. True to his promise, Mandela stepped down in 1999 after one term as president and began a new chapter of his life as a humanitarian and elder statesman. During his single term, he established the Nelson Mandela Children Fund in 1995, and later founded the Nelson Mandela Foundation and the Mandela Rhodes Foundation. Mandela always maintained a special interest in children. Mandela's charitable ambition stemmed from the unfair imprisonment of South African youth during apartheid. On his first day in Seattle, at a benefit dinner at the Sheraton Hotel, Mandela recalled to a transfixed audience how the South African apartheid government used to imprison children, whites to well-kept compounds with good foods and schools, Black children to unkept dungeons with no schools where they were subject to abuse and maltreatment. Mandela urged then South African President P.W. Botha to release the children from such unspeakable conditions, but Botha refused. When Mandela became president himself, one of his first acts in office was to release the children from prison. But many South African families would not take their children back, as they felt shamed by having a child in prison. So rather than leave the children to wander alone in poverty and harm's way on the streets, Mandela, feeling responsible for them, set up his first foundation to help the youth have a better life. It was at this point that the man who changed the 20th century would help shape the 21st. Mandela and his wife, Dr. Graca Machel, embarked on a global journey through their charitable foundations to promote healthcare, education, peace, conflict resolution, and economic development throughout the African continent. They both shared a binding interest in the concerns of children. In 1998, the Mandelas met cellular phone pioneer Craig McCall and his wife Susan at a telecommunications conference in South Africa. The McCalls invited the couple to Seattle on behalf of Teledesic, their satellite telecommunications company, to connect with the city, making a name for itself in the tech sector. Attracted by Seattle's reputation as a growing hub of new knowledge and philanthropy, Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel accepted the invitation for a 3-day visit to raise funds for their charitable foundations, forge connections with the city's philanthropists and educators, and spend time with students and community groups. With the support of the McCall Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Russell Family Foundation, Mandela and Dr. Machel arrived in Seattle on December 8, 1999. Governor Gary Locke, Mayor Paul Schell, and other dignitaries joined 800 school children in welcoming the famed freedom fighter and his wife. Serenaded by the Leshai School Choir, Mandela broke out into a little dance, then immediately hugged and kissed the children in the crowd after their performance. The emotional and joyous scene that unfolded that day stood in stark contrast to the chaotic WTO protests that rocked Seattle the week prior. The mood in the city was dark, as many remained seething over the mayhem that occurred downtown. City leaders fretted over Seattle's sullied reputation in the international spotlight. It was under these circumstances that Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel arrived on their trip to the Pacific Northwest. However, in the aftermath of the strife that divided Seattle, the presence of this amazing couple provided an inspiring counterpoint, a tonic of hope. Mandela lifted spirits and inspired Seattle to answer the major challenges that lay ahead in the next century. This is how a trip that was intended to raise funds for charities, create bridges between Africa's developing nations and Seattle's educational institutions, high-tech companies, and healthcare industries, elevated hopes. Mandela, without a doubt, pointed Seattle toward the horizon of the dawn of a new millennium. Tonight, we are gathered in community to celebrate this significant event and reflect upon Mandela's message 26 years later. Our awesome guest speakers will provide us with an intimate view of how the trip came to be and personal reflections on when Mandela visited Seattle. Our first speaker is a gentleman with a unique connection to Nelson Mandela and has a keen insight into his legacy. Paul Suzman arrived on the committee that welcomed Mandela in 1999 and is here to share his reflection on the man and his visit. In 1981, Paul founded Office Lease, the first commercial tenant representative firm on the West Coast. When not advising corporations on real estate or cycling, he is active on the executive committee of Village Reach's board of directors. He served on the board of Terrafaciani Italia Coffee Company before it sold to Starbucks. Paul is a senior advisor to Intentional Futures, a business advisor to healthcare technology company Paramedics, and is a member of the Seattle Rotary Club. Please join me in welcoming Paul Suzman to the stage.
This, above all else, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. This was Polonius' counsel to his son Laertes in Shakespeare's Hamlet, and words by which Nelson Mandela lived. Who was this man who, upon his release, radiated such grace and statesmanship, and who preached and practiced reconciliation despite the injustices and indignities heaped for decades upon himself and his family and his people? He was an enigma. Loyal to a fault, he maintained relationships with the likes of Castro, Gaddafi, and Arafat, despite their political toxicity to much of the West. Yet he forever forswore the divisive poison of tribal nepotism and racial enmity that lies at the root of so much conflict today. He was very human, an imperfect husband and father, as are so many of us, and he acknowledged as much with humility and without excuse. He was prideful at times and could be irascible, and there was much about his life about which to be irascible. Ladies and gentlemen, hopefully most here have gleaned from the exhibit upstairs some sense of what conditions must have been like under apartheid for South Africa's black majority. The exhibit provides a haunting snapshot of how, for over 27 years, Nelson Mandela and his colleagues were effectively hidden from view, and their character and beliefs obscured by censorship, misinformation, and paranoid propaganda. Under the brutal laws of apartheid, those banned persons or those who were disappeared and imprisoned under the Suppression of Communism Act or other draconian acts could not be quoted or their words printed, nor were their images ever allowed in any publication. Thus, growing up in South Africa, most people knew little about Nelson Mandela. My redoubtable Aunt Helen Suzman was, in the 1960s and 70s, the only woman in Parliament, and for over a decade, the only member of the opposition. As an MP, she was permitted access to Robben Island, something she insisted upon repeatedly. Prisoners reported that some conditions and their treatment preceding her visits would improve, and extra blankets would be provided. Their guards did not share their appreciation for such inspections. This was the start of a lifelong friendship between Helen and Nelson Mandela, and one that persisted through their declining years when they visited regularly. This forsaken place was the crucible in which Nelson Mandela would spend half his life to that point, and the anvil upon which his iron will was forged. In 2013, the year of Nelson Mandela's death at the British Museum in London, I happened upon the exhibit Shakespeare Staging the World, and in place of honor, on display, was the Robben Island Bible. It is a copy of the complete works of William Shakespeare. It had been smuggled onto Robben Island by another political prisoner, Sunny Venkatarathnam. He disguised it as a Hindu holy text. You see, literature was not permitted on that bleak windswept rock in case it should give the inmates the wrong ideas. It did quite the opposite. It gave them the right ideas. Nelson Mandela recognized the global truth that it is education, it is literature that sets people free. Even if his body was to be trapped for the rest of his life, as far as he and we knew, in those remote limestone quarries, surrounded by the chill depths of an indifferent grey Atlantic, the Robben Island Bible could transport him and his comrades to Elsinore and Venice, to Harfleur before St. Crispin's Day, or to the steps of the Senate in ancient Rome. It was words, thoughts, and soaring oratory that helped sustain them through the darkest of days, those and the unshakable belief in themselves and their righteousness of their cause, and the words of his favorite poem, Invictus, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul. When he was not inspiring his comrades with Shakespeare's acumen, Mandela became an avid student in Afrikaans history, literature, and language. He embraced Sun Tzu's admonition in The Art of War. You must understand the opposing commander, his literature, and language. Mandela would say, few things are more exciting to me here than to listen to a man's background, the factors that influenced his thoughts and actions, the unknown battles he has fought and won. After becoming president, he would take such reasoning to a new level. He would engage as personal assistant his adversary's daughter, Zelda Lagrange, a young Afrikaans woman. She remained with him for 20 years and protected him like a lioness. Ahmed Kathrada, who too was a prisoner, recounts in his book Letters from Robben Island of a chess game that lasted for 3 days, at which point the young medical student with whom Mandela was playing resigned from exhaustion. This was indicative of how Mandela played his political hands, relentlessly, patiently. Roger Sampson, a biographer, tells of a meeting between Mandela and his then attorney George Bizos in 1964. Bizos recounts, surrounded by 8 Deur prison guards and forced to wear short trousers and shoes without socks in a futile attempt to demoralize him, Mandela walked very upright, at his own pace, hands behind his back, and when he drew close, he greeted Bizos thus, "George," he said, "let me introduce you to my honor guard." And so he did, each one by name. You see, he regarded these young men to be victims of apartheid as much as were the prisoners. He insisted that everyone on Robben Island study, the young Afrikaner wardens included. Today, 25 years after Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel visited Seattle, there are numerous people here who were involved in the Building Bridges tour and in differing ways made it a success. My friend Bob Ratliff was central to the earliest planning and coordination. You will shortly be hearing from him about the origins, patrons, outcomes, and the various ceremonies and gatherings during their stay. It was in September 1999 that Bob called me enthusiastically with the news that Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel planned to visit the Emerald City in December. But then enthusiasm is Bob's default setting. The Seattle Rotary Club, to which I belonged, the fourth oldest and at that time the world's largest, was accorded with the privilege of hosting Nelson Mandela at its Wednesday meeting. We also made arrangements with Maestro Gerard Schwartz to hold the event at Benaroya Hall, where I had the honor of introducing him. And given his love of music, the Seattle Symphony would give a concert as tribute. We would include as guests at the event all Seattle school principals and vice principals, and as many school children as possible, including those in a choir who would be taught to sing the national anthem of the world's then youngest democracy. Then we had a bright idea. I made a call. Zelda, I inquired, would the president like to conduct the Seattle Symphony? The next day she called me back. The president said he's never conducted an orchestra before, she told me. Without thinking, I responded, "Well, Zelda, he's never run a country before either, has he? But he's doing a pretty good job at it." There was a sharp intake of breath, a disapproving pause, before she responded curtly in Afrikaans, "Ek sal dit terugbel," puts the phone down. She meant, "I'll get back to you." Less than an hour later, she called back laughing. "Madiba told me to tell you that he thinks you're very cheeky. He'd love to do it." Just before the concert, Gerard Schwartz in his office ceremonially presented to the conductor of my motherland's transition to democracy his very own baton. And then the maestro coached the president on how to conduct an orchestra. For those of you here today who might have been then present, as are a number of my fellow Seattle Rotarians, you'll remember that Mandela covered many subjects in his address: global politics, race relations, HIV/AIDS. He did not pull any punches. After the event, I asked the high school-aged daughter of a friend what she thought. "I loved it," she said, "but I never thought I'd be getting a lecture on safe sex from an 80-year-old man." These are treasured memories for many Seattleites, but we can also celebrate a concrete outcome from the Building Bridges tour to which Leonard referred. A sturdy and utilitarian bridge which has helped transform healthcare for millions of Africans. The organization Village Reach was born 25 years ago too. Its mission is to reduce inequities in access to quality primary care in countries across Africa. I'm privileged to still serve on its board and proud that Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel agreed to be our honorary chairs. She remains as such. Village Reach has 200 team members, some of whom are here this evening, have to date with its partners helped facilitate access to basic health care to over 111 million Africans across the continent. With offices in DRC, Côte d'Ivoire, Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, and of course Seattle, our goal is to reach 350 million people in Africa by 2030. Yeah. Gary. Close to home, Village Reach has applied over the last 5 years what it has learned from strengthening health systems in Africa to improve health equity in 20 counties right here in Washington. I believe Nelson Mandela, were he with us, would be proud to witness what is being accomplished by his and Graca Machel's Village Reach emissaries. But ladies and gentlemen, allow me to transport you back to the British Museum exhibit. The well-thumbed Robben Island Bible stood open in its protective glass case at a soliloquy by Julius Caesar shortly before his assassination. Each word was underlined in ink and initialed in the margin by Nelson Mandela, where Caesar exclaims, "Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once." It was 120 years ago that a lovely hymn was played publicly for a small time in a small church in Johannesburg. The opening words asked that God bless Africa. Nkosi sikelel Africa. The anthem was played and sung so joyously at Benroy Hall 25 years ago, with Nelson Mandela exuberantly conducting with his hallmark all-encompassing smile, and every member of the orchestra grinning just as broadly. Today, in our time of bitter divisions in our own land, as our democratic experiment faces unprecedented foundational stresses, when we yearn for our better angels to show themselves, we would do well to conjure up, to emulate Madiba's wisdom and restraint. I would suggest that on the 18th of July in 1918, at the town of Mvezo on the Umbashi River, at the birth of Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, God did indeed bless not only Africa, but the entire world. I would now ask to come up to the podium my longtime friend Bob Ratliff, president of Silver Creek Capital and former ringmaster of the Building Bridges Tour, to share with us the story behind it. But I would tell you this. Well, you were supposed to come up, but that's no, stay there. No, you just did. I want to tell them about you. Okay, and I'll get there because this just slide. Okay. So, Bob serves on the board of PayScore. He's the past chairman of the board of trustees of Seattle University and a past board member of Primera. He serves on the board of Cristo Rey Jesuit Seattle High School and is on the executive committee of the board of Behind the Badge Foundation. Bob.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to a number of people in this room. My friend Ambassador now, Roger Nias, is here somewhere. Thank you all. Thanks, Roger. People who are involved in bringing this together. And I really thought my purpose tonight, I told Leonard, is just to kind of give you the backstory. How did this really happen? And it's what does a billionaire do when he wants to give a South African president a wedding present is really how it started. So I had the 17 years of experience working with Craig McCaw, which was like 340 years in real time, I think, but it was a great series of experiences, this being a highlight. So we had at Teledesic, which was owned by Craig McCaw and Bill Gates together, had a team of people that had business development officers from around the world, and one of them was a man named Blaise Jujasato, who was responsible for Africa. And so as Blaise traveled around Africa, he was on an airplane one day, and you've had the experience, you're sitting next to somebody, and you start to chat, and you feel a real connection, and as you land, you introduce yourself. And Blaise introduced himself to this woman sitting next to him, and they exchanged business cards, and Blaise looked at it and said, "Are you Graca Machel that's married to Nelson Mandela?" And she said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "If you're ever in Cape Town, call me." So fast forward, Craig and Susan McCaw flew with Blaise to Johannesburg to the World Radio Conference. And Blaise said, "If you're here and you have your own airplane, you should go to Cape Town." So they did. And Blaise pulled out that business card, and he called Graca Machel and said, "We'd love to see you." And she said, "Please come for tea." So they sat in her living room and had tea, and down the stairs from his nap came Nelson Mandela. And they had this wonderful visit, and they got home, and Craig was still excited about it, and he said, "They've just gotten married. I'd like to give them a wedding present." Not knowing what to give them, Blaise called and said to Graca Machel, "What could we do? And could you come to Seattle?" And she said, "Well, we only travel when we can raise money for our foundations." They each had a community foundation. And Blaise went, "Oh, well, never mind." And he told Craig that, how are we going to do that? And I said, "Come on, you guys, let me tell you what she's really saying is, if you put on events for me and raise money, we'll come." So that began the organization of this 3-day visit. So as it came together, we, as Paul said, planned this. Paul, my only South African friend, I knew his Helen had been a member of Congress. I called Paul. My dad, like Paul, was a member of Seattle No. 4 Rotary. It all kind of started to happen. We got involved and engaged with Seattle U, where I had been, at that time, a member of the Board of Regents, and we all started to organize how this was going to come together. So we send the plane to South Africa to get him, and they land at Boeing Field, and as Craig and I stood at the bottom of the steps, he fills the doorway, quite a tall man, but in a Russian fur hat. He obviously read that Seattle was a cold, wet place, and he was prepared. But as you heard, we had that hangar full of young children and dignitaries to welcome them. And Craig said as he saw them on the plane, "Did you just get a chill?" I said, "Yeah, I did." And so as and I could tell you stories for 2 hours, so I'll spare you. But we'd had this wonderful welcome event. Somewhere along the way, I had called the police department and said, "We need a motorcade to move President Mandela around Seattle." They called me back and said, "We only do that for sitting presidents." I said, "Why don't you go into the chief of police and tell him that Nelson Mandela is coming to Seattle?" About 15 minutes later, he called and said, "Where would you like the motorcade and how long would you like to have it?" It was a slick way to get around town, I'll tell you. So we took him downtown, as Paul said, to the Symphony Hall to do this wonderful event of conducting the symphony and speaking to Seattle's finest. We then took him to a homeless daycare center, where coincidentally my wife was volunteering, where they held young children and comforted these kids, and it was terrific. And then we took him to Leshai Elementary School, where they participated with high school kids teaching grade school kids to read, a program called Team Read that still exists today. We then took him back to the Sheraton, gave him a few minutes to rest, and then off he went to this room full of people at the Sheraton. But it was really 2 events. It was an upstairs event, kind of a private reception, and then a large downstairs dinner. And Mandela thought this was a little barbaric, that you're charging people to have their picture taken with me, and then I'm going to this other event at a different rate. And I said, this is completely typical of American politics. So we kind of took a picture of all the volunteers outside, and we worked him through the room, and he and Graca Machel sat, and people got behind them and took these pictures, and then we got him downstairs to a room full of the Sheraton Ballroom. And there was, George Russell and Craig McCaw and all these dignitaries on the dais. And before the event, this is a little inside baseball, but I think it's a great story. The Gates Foundation's president had asked if she could just have a few minutes with the Mandelas so she could tell them what the Gates' gift was going to be, because she didn't want to have them talk about money at the breakfast at the Gates' house the next morning. So Patty Stonecipher was very kind, and she said, the Gateses are really excited to give you a $5 million commitment to the foundation. I think Mandela might have just patted her on the head and said, well, we'll talk about it tomorrow at breakfast. She says, no, don't talk about it at breakfast. So I had told Craig McCaw that the Gateses were going to give a gift, and he should think about his gift. And he said, well, I've given you for about 3 months, and I've sent the airplane to Cape Town. I have to write a check? I said, yeah, I think you probably want to write a check. So back to this dinner, Craig calls me up to the dais, and he's taken his table tent with his name on it. He's turned it over, and he's written it out like a check. Mandela Foundation, $1 million. He said, go give this to President Mandela. I said, no. He's coming to your house tomorrow night. You're going to have one-on-one time with the two of them, with your wife. You can tell them then. I hear this, Bob. I look down the table, and Mandela's calling me down the table. And I come, he said, we'd like them to come upstairs to the suite after dinner. I said, well, let me tell Craig. So I go back down the table, and Craig says, absolutely not. They've got to be exhausted. They've been awake for hours and hours. And I went back down and told Mandela, no, that's not a good idea. He said, I insist. I said, okay. So the dinner's over. It's a big success. And we take the 4 of them up to the suite, and we put them in the room, and I'm waiting outside the door. And after a little while, nature takes its course, and I have to run down the hall. I come back, my phone rings, and it's Craig. And I said, where are you? He said, well, we left. Where are you? I said, I had to go to the bathroom. He said, well, it was just unbelievable. It's unbelievable. He said, we're going to give them $5 million. And then Susan grabs the phone and says, each. And then Craig grabs the phone back and says, no, $7.5 million each. I said, I'm getting off the phone. This is getting very expensive. He said, you have to go in and tell them. So I knock on the door, and there's one staff guy who had traveled with them. And I said, is President Mandela still awake? Oh, yes, come in. So he's sitting in the corner in these two, easy chairs and reading a book. And I walked over and I said, President Mandela, can I have just a moment? He said, of course. So trying to get at eye level, I knelt down in front of his chair. And he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, Bob, two things. First, you are the only white man that has ever knelt in front of me. He said, please get up and sit in that chair. So I did. And he said, second thing is, cut this President Mandela stuff. You call me Madiba. We are family now. Highlight of my life. So I said, Madiba, I'm here because Craig and Susan were so taken with you, they want to make a $15 million commitment. And it was like a kid who had his first lick of ice cream. He shot out of the chair, gives me a huge hug, and then says, hang on. And he runs in to get Graca Machel out of bed. She comes out in her nightgown, and big hugs from her, and we kind of laugh and talk about it for a moment, and then I left. And the next morning, they're having breakfast with the Gateses. So he gets in the car to go to the University of Washington to this global health forum, and he says, I forgot to talk to him about money. You need to get me 10 more minutes. Okay, I'll do my best. So we went to this great event at the University of Washington. We did a convocation at Seattle University for the students at the University of Washington, Seattle U, and Seattle Central Community College. Father Sunborg gave him an honorary degree. There was a degree from Seattle Central and an honorary award from the UW, who doesn't give out honorary degrees. And so it was a great event, and then throughout the day, we moved them eventually to the McCaw's house. Had the TT Minor Children's Choir singing on the steps. People started to arrive with names you'd recognize, and the last people to arrive were Bill and Melinda Gates. And Mandelas are in the den waiting. I asked Bill Sr. if he could help me. He said, I don't keep track of him anymore. I don't know where he is. But finally, I put the Gateses and the Mandelas together and said, you've got 10 minutes. And about 15 minutes later, I opened the door and said, I really need you out here. And so the doors open, and Mandela fills the doorway with a big smile, and Bill Gates behind him, and Melinda behind him, and Graca Machel last, and she had a big smile, and I looked at her and I said, how did it go? She winked and said, $15 million. So between that evening and the event at the Sheraton, they left Seattle with $32 million in their two foundations. And I would say, as a guy who's done a lot of fundraising, that was a pretty successful 3 days. The next day, we had a, and some of you may have been there. There was a breakfast meeting back at Seattle U for members of the African American community. The people who protested so actively at the consul's house on Hillside for years were there to meet with him, and then they went over to the Gates Foundation for a kind of a goodbye press conference. And during that press conference, which was fantastic, Mandela said, well, I'll be leaving here and stopping in Florida to meet with President Clinton on the way back. My phone rings, and our pilot says, what's this about Florida? So when he came off the stage, I said, Madiba, what was this about going to see the president in Florida on the way home? And he said, well, it's kind of on the way, isn't it? I said, not exactly. So I said to Craig McCaw, do you mind if they stop in Florida on the way home? And he said, at this point, it's kind of a rounding error. I don't care what he does. But it was clearly the highlight of my life, and I think a lot of us who were involved in that process to watch this man move with such grace and watch his wife introduce him as just a country boy from Africa. And such a gift to Seattle for those 3 days to have touched so many people's lives and been so moving for any of us that were involved. So when Paul and Leonard called to say, can you kind of give the backstory, I was touched. And needless to say, I've told the story a couple of times, so I didn't really need any notes tonight because it's one of the stories that's the highlight of my life. And a few months after he left, I guess it was after Christmas, a big crate showed up in my living room with hay coming out of it, and I cracked it open, and it was a an African mask in a shadow box frame with a letter from Mandela. And Craig McCaw had made his actual wedding gift a mask from the Makah Indian tribe. No connection from the Scottish Macaws to the Native American macaws, but that mask holds a very special place in my collection of things over my lifetime. That it was something that I'll always treasure. I guess I should have started out with an apology. Unfortunately, I've got a little bit of a back problem, and I have a brace on, so I couldn't tuck my shirt in underneath this brace. And I thought Madiba would have thought it was okay that I was had my shirt untucked. So, again, with that, thank you for listening. I enjoyed being here, and I think I'm turning it over to you, Andrew. So.
Thank you, Paul and Bob, for your remarks and your reflections. Dustin Williams was among the 800 children who gave Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel a warm welcome to Seattle upon their arrival on December 8, 1999. Dustin, a descendant of the Suquamish and Duwamish chief Sial, presented a traditional talking stick designed for the occasion by Charles Elliott, a Coast Salish artist from the Sarlip First Nation. Dustin presented the talking stick to Mandela during the welcoming ceremony. The gift allowed Mandela, a tribal person himself, the authority to communicate with members of the tribe who received him on their land. Dustin is in attendance tonight and has joined us for the evening. Please help me give a hand and a warm welcome to Dustin. Seattle maintains a deep intellectual, emotional, and political connection to Nelson Mandela. It was one of many cities to rise in solidarity with Nelson Mandela to oppose the repressive system of apartheid in South Africa. While anti-apartheid movements around the globe ebbed and flowed, activists in Seattle carried out one of the most active and diligent grassroots campaigns against apartheid from the late 1970s until its collapse in 1994. Beginning in 1976, in the aftermath of the Soweto uprising, activists in the Central District urged local banks to cease making loans to South African banks. As the 1980s progressed, opposition to apartheid grew louder. Ordinary individuals from different backgrounds, racial groups, ages, religious beliefs, social organizations, and political ideologies came together under shared values to form a true grassroots movement under the banner of the Seattle Coalition Against Apartheid. Committed to equality and building a world of love with mutual respect amongst all humanity, Seattle joined Nelson Mandela in his long walk to freedom. In December of 1984, the coalition orchestrated a 4-year-long protest on each Sunday in front of the Madison Park residence of the honorary South African consulate, forming a wall of noise to denounce his presence and voice their opposition to apartheid. The anti-apartheid movement would touch the conscience of our city and transform Seattle's culture. Activists brought awareness to the plight of Nelson Mandela and those under apartheid rule through educational forums, cultural events, and candlelight vigils to commemorate the victims lost in the struggle. They picketed local businesses selling South African goods and joined the international call under Mandela's guidance for an economic boycott. The coalition was instrumental in persuading our local government to forbid the use of South African goods and pressuring Seattle universities to divest from South Africa. They prevented the use of South African granite to construct the Metro bus tunnel and were successful in their effort in forcing the Seattle Pension Board to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. The Seattle anti-apartheid movement attracted a great deal of global attention as international activists such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Fred Dubé, and Chris Hani came to our city to join our protests and speak out against apartheid. People around the world witnessed Seattle's agencies as newspaper headlines depicted countless activists being led away in handcuffs from the steps of the consulate's home during their protests. The Seattle anti-apartheid movement shows us that ordinary people, joined in solidarity, can affect change on a national and global stage. On February 11, 1990, Seattle joined the world in celebrating Mandela's release from prison after 20 years of incarceration at Mount Zion Baptist Church. It was an emotional but cheerful celebration on a day that many believed would not happen in their lifetime. Many activists continued their support for Mandela by serving as international monitors during South Africa's historic election of 1994, taking on roles as legal advisors during the drafting of its new constitution, and serving on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help the country heal from apartheid. Mandela always held anti-apartheid activists in high regard and always sought to meet them to offer his thanks for their support. At the welcoming ceremony at Boeing Field, he got the chance to meet a few of the activists who helped advance his cause. Mandela graciously thanked them and noted that they kept hope alive when world leaders allowed apartheid to continue. He gave credit to Seattle's activism and stated, "Even without the international community, the people of South Africa would have won, but the struggle would have cost a lot of bloodshed and suffering. And the fact that the anti-apartheid movement came to our assistance certainly made the struggle less costly. They lifted our spirits. We knew that our cause would triumph. We are ever grateful for that support." Among the activists who met with Mandela was our very own Larry Gossett. Unfortunately, Larry is unable to join us tonight, but we wish him well and look forward to having him at the museum for our next program in August. At this time, I would like you to join me in honoring our anti-apartheid warriors who joined Mandela in his long walk to freedom. If you participated in the movement, please take a stand. Larry Gossett, Mariamu El Tayeb Givens, Eddie Wright Jr., Ricky Malone, who was also the principal of Leshai Elementary School at the time he visited, Gerald Lenoir, Rick Harwood, Reverend Robert Jeffrey, C.Z. Beckwith, and many others. Thank you for showing us that when people come together in solidarity, they can affect global change, no matter how tough the odds. Nelson Mandela stated that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Our next speaker is the living embodiment of that quote, as she has affected change around the globe. Professor Judith Mayotte created for Marquette University its South Africa Service Learning Program in conjunction with the Desmond Tutu Foundation and the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Earlier, through a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, Mayotte wrote Disposable People, the Plight of Refugees, and served as an advocate for refugees and internally displaced civilians as a board member of several refugee organizations. She served as a special advisor on refugee issues and policies in the Department of State during the first Clinton administration. She has been a professor at several universities and is a television producer and researcher as well. It is my honor to introduce to you Judith Mayotte and welcome her to the stage for her reflections.
Thank you, Anthony, and all of you people of Mohi for this wonderful, wonderful evening. What a treat it is to be here with all of you this evening to take a wonderful walk down memory lane. Thanks to this magnificent exhibit of Nelson Mandela, and now being here, not only to take a look back, but also to reflect on how Madiba's message resonates with us today. Looking back for a moment at my role in the 1999 Planning Committee was to work with the McCaw Foundation's Tricia McKay on developing a curriculum study guide for books on Mandela and the bringing to birth of a new South Africa. To me, it was genius and most generous of the McCaw Foundation to place in Seattle schools for all grade levels books dealing both with the person of Nelson Mandela and the history of his times, so that the visit of Mandela and Graca Machel could linger longer in the hearts and minds of the students. Fortunately, the McCaws knew that the students were growing to adulthood in a world that was increasingly globalized. This study project was one that could help them along more to be engaged, educated, and enthusiastic global citizens. And in an increasingly divisive world abounding with conflict and climate change, students could become aware of a country and a people, thanks largely to Nelson Mandela and his committed comrades, who chose to settle differences through reconciliation rather than revenge, and restorative justice rather than retributive justice, as played out in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by that wonderful Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Education and educational institutions figured prominently throughout the visit because both were critical to Mandela's own emergence as a leader. So let me begin my reflection this evening on the role of education in Mandela's life with some words he wrote towards the end of his presidency in South Africa. He said, "I was not born with a hunger to be free. I was born free, free in every way that I could know. But then I slowly saw that not only was I not free, but my brothers and sisters were not free. I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated as surely as the oppressed. The oppressed and oppressor alike were robbed of their humanity." Now, two forms of education played a critical role for Mandela as he walked his long road to freedom. One of heart, or really his very soul, in value formation, and the other of mind, for the practical knowledge he needed in the life he led as a transformative political leader. During those first years of Madiba's life in the Transkei, home of the Xhosa Nation, he was free to roam the rolling hills surrounding the secure rendezvous on his verdant home valley and along rivers and streams. He herded cattle with his friends and absorbed the cultural heritage from the elders. It is here that his heart education began and took root. His was an African culture of the spirit of Ubuntu. Ubuntu, what a delicious word. Ubuntu has everything to do with relationship, for a person is only a person in relation to other persons. This worldview values affirmation and acceptance of the other, interdependence, interconnection, participation, openness, and a concern for the common good. To live in a world of Ubuntu assumes forgiveness, reconciliation, and rehabilitation. Desmond Tutu, in his book, No Future Without Forgiveness, says, "Our humanity is caught up in that of all others. We are human because we belong. We are made for community, for togetherness, for family, to exist in a delicate network of interdependence." Now, local governments among Mandela's people came through consensus, a form of democratic living. Consensus could only be achieved by exquisite listening to each other, as well as from understanding and respect between the governor and the governed. Agreement came through discussion. Although his father maintained his traditional religious beliefs, his mother converted to Christianity, and they baptized their young son a Methodist. Local church ministers saw a promise in the boy and felt that he should be educated. The first in his family to be formally educated, 7-year-old Madiba entered the one-room mission school wearing a pair of his father's trousers that had been cut off at the knee and were tied at the waist with a string. Later, he reminisced, "I have never owned a suit I was prouder to wear than my father's cut-off trousers." On that day, the teacher gave him the name Nelson, probably because she could not pronounce his birth name. Following the death of his father 2 years later, young Nelson and his mother went to the Regent's home where Nelson and Justice, the chief's son, shared a rendezvous. Following his initiation ritual at age 16, Nelson attended Clarksbury, the oldest Methodist educational mission in the Transkei. And from then on, a wider world opened for Mandela, first at Helltown, a Wesleyan college, and then at Fort Hare. Now, to no one's surprise, each of us face many what-ifs in our lives. Mandela was no exception. What if he and Justice, faced with arranged marriages an ailing chief planned for them, had not run away to Johannesburg to escape such a plight? And what if Mandela had not been expelled from Fort Hare due to a principled disagreement with the administration? His stand for justice at Fort Hare and his Johannesburg exposure to just how unfree the majority of Black South Africans were set Mandela on a path that almost cost him his life. Ultimately, he did complete his BA at Witwatersrand University and obtained a law degree as well. This enabled him not only to serve tirelessly in the African National Congress, or the ANC, but also rise in the ranks of leadership to its presidency. From his early life of freedom and exposure to democracy through consensus governance, he readily accepted the ANC's vision and principles. Basically, these are one person, one vote, with equality in a non-racial society, as well as freedom for all and democracy attained by changing hearts and minds through negotiations and peaceful means. There came a day, though, for Mandela when he found himself compelled to create the ANC's militant arm with the purpose of bringing the oppressors to the negotiating table. This, of course, led to his arrest, his guilty verdict, and his life sentence on Robben Island. Desmond Tutu's wise words are worth noting. That time and present was actually crucial in the evolution of a moral giant. When he went to jail, he was very angry, but he grew in his understanding of the fears and apprehension of a minority who thought they were going to be swamped. And by the time he went out, he was ready to go more than just a second mile. Realizing that there was no victory by military might, Mandela knew he must understand the mind and heart of his oppressor. So he set about learning the Afrikaans language, history, and cultural values. He treated his warders and everyone else with respect and hoped for the same in return. Lifers with him, like Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, Govind Mbeki, Joe Slovo, and many others, who never gave up hope of their sense of purpose and consistently planned through study and discussion and implementation of their vision of a new South Africa, believing very firmly that they too would be citizens of that new South Africa. They dubbed the big hole that was the Robben Island's lime quarry their Robben Island University, helping young, angry militant men, newly sentenced, through purposeful discussion and education while working in the quarry, to change their hearts and minds and look to believe in a future of freedom and democracy for all. Once out of prison, Mandela continued along his long, thoughtful walk, drawing from the well of learning of both heart and mind. In his words, "When I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." Brian O'Connell, once UWC's chancellor, noted, "Building the new, paving a gravel path to become a smooth surface upon which all might easily steer, is painstaking and slow in creating both a near and distant future. Creating a culture of peace and reconciliation has a very practical cast to it, as Mandela well knew. It encompassed the political, economic, social, and religious life of all the peoples of South Africa. Within South Africa's borders live peoples who recognize 11 different languages. This beautiful country is a rainbow mixture of races, cultures, traditions, and religions. Yet within its borders exists a very high crime rate, an ever-widening gap between excessive wealth and life-threatening poverty, racism, a lack of access to equal education, unequal access to housing, clean water, adequate sanitation, health care, employment, and more. Though tensions mount, citizens continue to travel the long road Mandela traveled to build and create a more habitable, equitable, and secure future within his homeland, and he called on other countries to do the same in these words: "I have walked that long road to freedom. I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to look back at the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended. Nor, my friends, is ours. What do we do with the truth once we know it? As Marian Wright Edelman reflected, the answers lie in the values we stand for and in the actions that we take today." Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for your remarks and reflections. In the convocation held at Seattle University, Nelson Mandela and Graca Machel addressed a large crowd of high school and college students from around the region to speak on the major challenges facing humanity at the turn of the century. Mandela remarked how the passion of young people continuously reminds us of a new order and faith in the future, rooted in the unity of our humanity and our common sharing of responsibility, the one for the other. Mandela then challenged the audience to meet its moment and forge a better future. He stated, "We are at the end of the century and the millennium. For those who came along through the 20th century, there is much cause to register disappointment about what humanity has failed to achieve despite the great advances that have been made in other areas. You, the young, represent the future and are the hope of humanity. For the youth, the future beckons. It is now in your hands to make the next century one which will be the best of the human spirit will truly triumph. You can build a world in which peace takes precedent over war and force, in which the poor and vulnerable are put central of our own concerns, in which ignorance and prejudice are disparaged, where the protection of our national environment is as great concern as the acquisition of profits through development. We have faith in you. Tonight, we are joined by one of our future leaders of the next generation to reflect on Mandela. Please join me in welcoming our young history makers from the group Rising Suns and the Central Area Youth Association to the stage.
Good evening. My name is Gerald Donaldson, retired family support worker from Seattle Public Schools, 33 years. During the March of the pandemic, Dr. Audrey Williams, who heads Kingmakers of Seattle, called and said that the parents had wanted to know why we weren't educating our young babies. So myself, having started Rising Sons at Leschi over 20 to 15 years ago, we started Rising Sons Extended. The purpose of that is to introduce our young kings and queens to their history. As you know, in our history books, it always remains a mystery to what we do and what we've accomplished. So we study purposely every month a different person in Black history, and then we go on a field trip to hopefully coincide with what we just studied. So this is one of our young kings here, Josiah. He's been with us from the concept of the program. I must say thank his mom in the back there. She brought him down on a last-minute call because some of the people had backed out, couldn't make it. But Anthony and the Mohai staff has always welcomed us. Fortunately, most of the exhibits that they have when it deals with Black history, we are the first group to see it, so they get a first-hand look and the knowledge. So I won't take long, but this young man here, I'm gonna bring him a little closer, a star. He's very dedicated. Enjoys what he does, and he just said that he's not shy because he's done plays before. So I'm gonna give him the stage, and I can be quiet. Josiah. What did you think about the Mandela exhibit when you first came?
Okay, so when I first came to Mohai for the Mandela exhibit, I came here not really knowing who Nelson Mandela was. And then once I entered, I saw a lot of stuff that I didn't even know existed. And I had a lot of instructors help me and help me understand more. And ever since that Nelson Mandela exhibit, I've liked to go home and get on my phone and research more about him, because it showed me a lot about who he is. Yeah.
Can you highlight anything that stood out to you about Nelson Mandela?
The things that stood out was the missions he accomplished. When I went to the exhibit, I saw that Nelson Mandela did a lot more than what I expected. He helped unite countries together, and I thought that was really awesome. He went to the way he was always calm was super interesting, and he was just a great person in general.
Thank you. One of the purposes of what we do is because we only have really 15 days of Black history a year in a school district, right? So it's the shortest month of the year. So we purposely, every month, as I said earlier, and sometimes it's a two-month lesson, just studying our history so we can know what we're doing, our history can continue. And I know with this young king here, we're going to be in good hands. So thank you for allowing us a few minutes of your time. You good?
Thank you to Rising Suns and the Central Area Youth Association for joining us tonight. On what will be his 107th birthday, the world will celebrate July 18th as Nelson Mandela International Day. This is a moment for all to renew with the values that inspired Nelson Mandela. I would like to bring Paul Suzman back to the stage to offer us some closing thoughts on Mandela and what he means to us.
Firstly, Joaquin, thank you for joining us. I think Nelson Mandela surprised everyone with what he did. You're not alone. Amazing man. So, for one last time, back to the Robben Island Bible. Anguishing over his role in Caesar's assassination, Shakespeare's Mark Antony calls out, Caesar's spirit, ranging for revenge with 8 by his side, come hot from hell, shall in these confines, with a monarch's voice, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. As long as our species have ranged across this planet, we have regularly acted on our baser instincts for retribution, both on a personal and national level. But every so often, and never often enough, human history has beheld examples of hope and courage and beauty that rise above the impulse for reprisal. When Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years of incarceration, during which time his family was hounded and persecuted, and 2 years later was sworn in as president of a democratic South Africa, he unleashed no dogs of war or revenge with 8 at its side. No, he untethered something infinitely more compelling and contagious. He unleashed reconciliation. He halted in its tracks the potential for vendetta that could have degenerated into civil war. He exhorted South Africans of all walks of life that when you exact an eye for an eye, you are all blinded. As had President Lincoln 130 years earlier, he recognized the value of a team of rivals, of gathering his opponents close about him. And as had Ulysses at Grant at Appomattox in 1864 treated with deference the defeated Robert E. Lee, odious though the cause was for which the Confederates had fought, and told him that his men should take home with them their horses and their sidearms to rebuild a war-torn nation. So did Mandela instinctively comprehend that you allow your former foes to retain their dignity, never denigrate anyone. As he said at his inauguration, never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. Ladies and gentlemen, our beautiful land is currently polarized to a degree perhaps not witnessed since the time of Lincoln and Grant. Moderate politicians, sadly, are often now punished for their moderation. Intolerance tends to be the norm. But it is up to all of us here tonight to set an example for our leaders and to join and to be the ones to emulate Nelson Mandela, to reach out to those we might know across the political divide, to, as he exhorted, listen to a person's background and the factors that influence their thoughts and actions. Find out what you have in common rather than what sets you apart. This, above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. As we all return home this evening, may we be imbued with the boundless and generous spirit of this most valiant man whose life we have just celebrated. Thank you, Anthony and Leonard and your team for staging this exhibit and for making possible this evening's celebration. In closing, I'll take the liberty of speculating that were Madiba here present, he might just choose to send everybody home with a Gaza admonition, Yenza okulungoleyo, do the right thing. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Just one note before we depart, we'll have the exhibit open until 9 p.m., so if you need more time to explore it, or if you haven't seen it yet, you have you got about 40 minutes or so. My clock is right. But please enjoy the rest of the evening, enjoy the galleries, and thank you again so much for coming out tonight and joining us and reflecting on this special event. Thank you.